As I'm sure practically all of you know, Australia and the United States were very strong allies during the Second World War and fought side by side along various fronts. Knowing this, you may be surprised to learn that during the war, Australian and American soldiers didn't always exactly get along, with these tensions between our allied nations sometimes boiling over, and eventually culminating in an all-out riot on the streets of one of Australia's largest cities, which would end up leaving one Australian soldier killed, with numerous others from both sides being hospitalised. I'm of course talking about the infamous Battle of Brisbane, but how did the tensions between these soldiers get to the point that people would eventually be killed? And what actually happened over the course of this riot? Well, those are the questions I'm going to be answering in today's video, so without further ado, let's get straight into it. Also, I'm sorry if you can hear some rain or whatever outside, it's currently quite stormy where I live. Now, before I get into the reasons why tensions often existed between Australian and American soldiers during their stay in our homeland, I'll be remiss not to say that the vast majority of the time, soldiers from our respective countries got along quite well, and fights/riots like what we're about to go over were the exception rather than the rule. Now, with that little disclaimer out the way, let's get into the main reasons why tensions did often exist between our two nations. Firstly, American soldiers stationed in Australia received both far better rations and pay than their Australian counterparts, which was only made more pronounced by the fact that shops and hotels regularly gave preferential treatment to Americans. Additionally, US uniforms were seen as more attractive than those of the Australians, which combined with the fact that the US Army provided silk stockings and candy to American troops, which they then handed out to Australian women during a time when Australians were on a poor diet, due to the rationing of food to civilians, predictably resulted in many of these American soldiers having a lot of luck with Australian women, which in turn led to many Americans eventually marrying Australian women, a fact which was not surprisingly greatly resented by the Australians. Sergeant Bill Benson of the US Army was later quoted as saying about this situation that the Americans had the chocolates, the ice cream, the silk stockings, and the dollars. They were able to show the girls a good time, and the Australians became very resentful about the fact they just lost control of their own city. As a result of all this, their overpaid, oversexed, and over here became a common phrase used by Australians around this time, displaying their discontent at the exceptionally large American presence in most cities. While I'm sure most of you are aware that women, usually through no fault of their own, are often a reason for conflict between men, this was far from the only thing that angered Australian soldiers during this period. This whole situation was made much worse when it became apparent that the American general in charge of the whole Pacific War, Douglas MacArthur, expressed a low opinion of Australian troops who were at the time fighting the Kokoda Tract. Though Australia was bearing the brunt of the land war in New Guinea by itself, MacArthur would report back to the United States on American victories, while Australian victories were communicated to the United States as American and Allied victories. Americans' general ignorance of Australia and the American perception that Australians lacked a certain get-up-and-go attitude also soured relations. Likewise, Australians also looked down upon the fighting qualities of the Americans, with most considering the Americans all glitz and glamour. This feeling towards the Americans would be worsened by the aforementioned escapades of MacArthur, with the most extreme example of him stealing Australian victories being the Battle of Bunna, where Australian troops bore the brunt of the fighting due to American quote-unquote inactivity, and would eventually repel the Japanese almost single-handedly. This battle by MacArthur was then presented as not only the first major victory, when in reality it was the fourth, but nonetheless as an American one. This happened many other times during the war as well, and dramatically worsened the relationship between Allied soldiers, with many Australians often regarding the US soldiers as boasting how they, and they alone, saved Australia. Which, no offense to any Americans watching this, that does not surprise me at all, and is probably about the most American thing I've ever heard. While there were a few other reasons leading to tensions between Australians and Americans, such as the Australian disapproval of the segregation of the nearly 100,000 African American troops who would be stationed here, which is a bit ironic considering how most Australians were treating the Aboriginals in civilian life, but whatever. Now that we understand why there was so much tension between the two nations' soldiers, I think it's time that we get into what actually happened in Brisbane that night. On the 26th of November 1942, an intoxicated American, Private James R. Steen, of the US 404th Signal Company, left the hotel where he'd been drinking when it closed at about 6:50 p.m. and began walking to the post exchange on the corner of Creek and Adelaide Street, some 50 metres, or 55 yards for the Americans watching, down the road. On his walk, he stopped to chat with three Australians when Private Anthony E. O'Sullivan of the US 814th Military Police approached Steen and asked for his leave pass. While the drunk Steen was looking for it, the MP became impatient and asked him to hurry up before grabbing his pass and arresting him. At this, Steen's newly found Australian friends began swearing at the MP, telling him to leave Steen alone. It is worth noting that the American MPs were not very well regarded by the Australians due to the belief that they were arrogant and used batons at the least provocation, which probably contributed to this. This belief would prove to be true, as O'Sullivan soon raised his baton as if to strike one of the Australians, which resulted in them attacking him. This quickly escalated as more MPs arrived on the scene, followed by nearby Australian servicemen and several civilians who rushed to help their countrymen. Outnumbered, the MPs retreated to the PX, carrying the injured O'Sullivan, with Steen opting to go with them. In the meantime, a crowd of up to 100 Australian servicemen and civilians had gathered and began to besiege the PX, throwing bottles and rocks and breaking several windows. Police Inspector Charles Price arrived at the scene but could do nothing as the crowd continued to grow, with the American Red Cross Club diagonally opposite of the PX also coming under attack. Further sporadic fights broke out across the city, with servicemen being ordered back to their barracks and ships, while soldiers fixed with bayonets escorted women in the city from the area. By 8 PM, up to 5,000 people were involved, and essentially all hell had broken loose, with even many Australian MPs removing their armbands and joining in. The situation reached dangerous new heights when Corporal Duncan Caporn commandeered a small truck driven by an Australian officer and 3 soldiers. The truck contained 4 Owen submachine guns, several boxes of ammo, and some hand grenades. Back at the PX nearby where this had started, the 738th MP Battalion began arming their MPs with shotguns to protect the building, and moved to the front. People in the crowd unsurprisingly did not take well to this, and attempted to take Private Norbert Grant of C Company's weapon. Grant in response jabbed one Australian with his gun before gunner Edward S. Webster, a driver with the 2nd Australian Anti-Tank Regiment, grabbed the barrel, while another soldier grabbed the American around the neck. During this scuffle, the gun was fired 3 times, with the first shot hitting Webster in the chest, killing him instantly. The following 2 shots hit Private Kenneth Henkel in the cheek and forearm, Private Ian Tiemann in the chest, Private Frank Corey in the thigh, Sapper DeVosso in the thigh, and Lance Corporal Richard Edson in the left thigh and hand, while also receiving a compound fracture of his left ankle, which actually resulted in him being discharged from the army later on. 2 civilians were also hit by this gunfire, with Joseph Hanlon being wounded in the leg and 18-year-old Walter Maidment also being wounded. In the confusion following this, Grant managed to run back towards the PX, hitting an Australian over the head with his shotgun during the process, breaking the butt of his weapon while doing so. An American soldier, Private Joseph Hoffman, also received a fractured skull in this scuffle. By about 2 hours later, at 10 PM, the crowd had finally dispersed, leaving the ground of the American PX completely destroyed. A war correspondent, John Hind, who was on a hotel balcony overlooking the scene, later stated, "The most furious battle I ever saw during the war was that night in Brisbane. It was like a civil war." You'd be mistaken if you thought it ended there, however, as the following night a smaller but still significant crowd of 500 to 600 Australian servicemen gathered outside the Red Cross building, but were seemingly dissuaded from doing anything too drastic by heavily armed American MPs inside the building. Things got a bit more tense in Queen Street, however, when a group of Australian soldiers armed with MP batons ran into 20 US MPs who formed a line and drew their handguns. Luckily, an Australian officer intervened and managed to persuade the American commander to take his men away from the area. Following this, the crowd outside the Red Cross moved to the corner of Queen and Edward Streets outside MacArthur's headquarters in the AMP building and began shouting abuse towards the building, while many small scuffles broke out between Australian and American soldiers around them, resulting in more than 20 people being injured. Before long though, this too eventually settled down, with the aforementioned US Army Sergeant Bill Benson, who was present on both nights, stating that, "But after that it sort of settled down, and you go into a pub and an Aussie would come up and slap me on the back. Oh, wasn't that a good ruckus we had the other night? And have a beer on me." End quote. All in all, on the first night, 1 Australian serviceman was killed, 8 people suffered gunshot wounds, and several hundred people were injured. On the second night, 8 US MPs, 1 serviceman, and 4 American officers were hospitalised, with countless others injured. Following the carnage, the units involved were relocated out of Brisbane, the MP's strength was increased, the Australian canteen was closed, and the American PX was relocated. As for the American soldier who killed Edward Webster, he was later court-martialed by the US military authorities for manslaughter, but was acquitted on the grounds of self-defense. 5 Australians were also convicted of assault, with 1 being jailed for 6 months. While this was the last major incident like this to happen in Brisbane, it was unfortunately not the last of its kind, with similar smaller riots later occurring in Townsville, Rockhampton and Mount Isa in Queensland, as well as Melbourne, Bondi, Perth and Fremantle in other parts of the country. Well guys, I think that's where I'm going to end this one. This is quite a crazy story and one I enjoyed talking about, so I hope you did too. If you did, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more content from me. But anyways, with all that being said, hope you guys have a great day, night, wherever you are, and I hope to see you all in the next one.